Welcome back. So in this video, we will be implementing our own implementation of an event emitter. So an event emitter is a mechanism or a programming pattern which allows certain event listeners to subscribe to an event, and like whenever those event happens, the listeners execute some callback functions in adherence to that event. So let's say I create an event emitter and I subscribe to an event one. And what I want is whenever event one happens, whenever event one is emitted, whenever event one is triggered, I want these two callback functions to be called with the data that was passed to that with the data that was passed when the event was emitted. So when this happens, the output will be listener one hello, which was passed in when the event was emitted, and listener two hello, which was called using this. And I also want a mechanism with which allows me to remove all the callback functions from that event. So when I call event one listener dot release, I don't want any callback functions to be called when event one is emitted, right? So when event one is emitted, I don't want any output at all because I've released all the callback functions from event one listener. So this is pretty useful when you want to detect some changes, like some, let's say, some click events or some form submission events or some hover events, and like whenever these events are emitted or triggered by browser, you want some callback functions to be called. So these are like pretty useful in such cases. So let's try to implement it. So first we'll call a constructor and define the listeners here. What the all the different types of listeners we have. So it will be empty by default. Now we have a subscribe method. So let's create a subscribe method. Subscribe method takes an event name and callback functions array. Event name and the rest are callback functions. So first we will check if the event name already exists in the listeners array. Const index is equal to this dot listeners dot find index item dot list item dot event name equal to event name. Now if index if index exists, then we just need to push the callback functions in the already existing callback functions of that item. So let's just do this dot listeners index dot callback functions dot push callback functions. If it doesn't exist, what we need to do is we need to initialize this index. We just need to initialize this index uh, equal to, and now this will be an object. First item will be event name. Second item will be callback functions. This will be empty, or rather we'll just assign it to callback functions, and we have a release. We will declare this later. I'll just give it an empty function here. We'll just write the body here later, and we will just return this. We'll return this dot listeners index. Why? Because whenever we subscribe, we also want that listener here to be returned, so we can call the release method here. So we'll just return this thing. So we can have release method available, which will help us remove all the listeners from that particular listener item. Now we also need an emit method. Now emit method takes an event name and subsequent arguments. So it will be event name and subsequent arguments. Now we'll check again the same thing, const index equal to, I'll just copy this thing. Right. Now if index is -1, greater than -1, that means the item is available in the listener, we'll call the callback functions. This dot listeners index dot callback functions dot for each callback function, callback function, arguments, right? And this is like pretty much it. Let's try to call this and see if it is calling functions. So let's see this listeners index dot callback. Okay, this is listeners. All right, so we need to push this thing here. Dot push. Now let's see. Carried 47 defined reading release. Uh-huh. So we'll just return here this dot listeners index, and I'll just move this. This will be this dot listeners, this dot listeners dot length minus one. Now let's see. All right, so it's working. The only thing is not working is the release one. We first initialize an event listener, and when we emit an event, we have listener one hello, listener two hello. Then we release, and then we emit again. But ideally, it should not be called. Now we will implement our release method implementation here. So what will happen is, see, in release, we want to remove all the callback functions from this listener item. So we'll just do the same thing again, const index equal to, I'll just copy this thing, paste this thing. Now, if index is minus one, we need to remove this. We need to remove all the callback functions from here. This dot listeners index dot callback functions is equal to an empty array. So this is all I think we would need. I'll just call this thing again. Cannot read properties of undefined. Reading find index. All right. This dot listeners find index item. All right. Let's just console log listeners here. This dot listeners clear. Listeners is undefined. All right. Why is listeners undefined? This dot listeners push release const index is equal to this dot listeners dot find index. All right. So I think we would need to convert this into an arrow function here, and we'll call this thing. And we are seeing that it works. So earlier we were not using our arrow function. We were using simple function declaration, which was, I think, this dot listeners was then pointing to this object here, and this since there are no listeners here, it was pointing to undefined. So an arrow function, what will it will do is it will pass its scope to the parent implementation, not to the root implementation, not the parent implementation. So it's a different thing. So when you use function keyword, what will happen is it will pass its lexical scope to its just parent object, but when you use an arrow function, it will pass its lexical scope to root object. So since listeners are present at root level and there are no listeners present in this object, there is no listeners key present in object, so it was giving us undefined. So, yep, this was it for now, and I will see you in next one.